What if I told you that one Viking raid was so terrifying, it changed how empires negotiate forever? In 845 AD, Ragnar Lothbrok didn't just attack Paris. He invented political terrorism, extracting the largest ransom in medieval history without losing a single man. This is the story of how Ragnar turned psychological warfare into profit and accomplished the impossible negotiation that made emperors pay tribute to Vikings who appeared from nowhere. Paris in 845 AD stood as the beating heart of the most powerful empire in Western Europe. Emperor Charles the Bald commanded armies that stretched from the Atlantic to the Alps, with stone walls protecting his capital that had never been breached by foreign enemies. The Frankish Empire represented Charlemagne's legacy, a Christian kingdom that saw itself as Rome's successor, protected by divine favor and military might that had conquered nations. The perfect target. What made Paris irresistible to Ragnar wasn't its walls or soldiers, it was its psychological significance. The city represented everything the Franks believed about their own power: divine protection, imperial authority, and the superiority of Christian civilization. Paris had never fallen because no enemy had dared attempt what Ragnar was planning. But while other raiders saw an impossible fortress, Ragnar Lothbrok saw opportunity. Where they feared imperial armies, he saw psychological vulnerability. Where they saw divine protection, he saw a weapon that could be turned against its owners. Tonight, as 120 dragon ships sailed up the Seine toward the heart of Christendom, Ragnar would prove that sometimes terror is more profitable than conquest. Warriors! If you want to witness the birth of political terrorism and the ransom that broke an empire, strike that red shield. Join the raid and see how Ragnar turned fear into the ultimate weapon. Ragnar Lothbrok stood on the cliffs of Denmark, his long blonde braided hair whipping in the North Sea wind, piercing ice-blue eyes studying maps of the Seine River. His massive warrior frame carried the scars of 30 campaigns, but his mind was calculating something unprecedented. 120 longships, 5,000 battle-hardened Vikings, a journey 200 miles into the heart of enemy territory. Every advisor called it suicide. Ragnar called it profit. Ragnar's plan was as brilliant as it was terrifying. Sail directly to Paris, bypass all smaller targets, and hold the capital itself hostage. Not for conquest, for ransom. This required more than courage. It demanded psychological mastery. His fleet would have to navigate hostile rivers, avoid Frankish armies, and create such terror that an emperor would pay rather than fight. Most importantly, they had to prove that nowhere was safe from Viking reach. The largest Viking fleet ever assembled gathered in the Danish fjords. Dragon-proud longships stretched across the water like a forest of sea monsters, each vessel carrying warriors who had sworn to follow Ragnar to Valhalla itself. These weren't ordinary raiders. They were maritime specialists who understood that this mission would either make them legendary or make them dead. Each ship represented years of raiding profits invested in the ultimate gamble. Sailing up the Seine required navigational genius that bordered on supernatural. Ragnar's fleet moved like a serpent through hostile territory, past settlements that should have stopped them, avoiding Frankish forces that should have destroyed them. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Viking ships sailing in broad daylight toward the empire's heart sent a message more terrifying than any battle. Nowhere was beyond Viking reach. Reports spread faster than the ships themselves. As news reached Charles the Bald's court, panic spread through the Frankish nobility like plague. The impossible was happening. Viking ships approaching Paris itself, sailing where no enemy had dared venture. Court advisors who had dismissed Vikings as coastal raiders suddenly faced a fleet capable of striking the empire's heart. The psychological warfare had begun before Ragnar fired a single arrow. Easter Sunday, 845 AD. Parisians emerging from morning prayers witnessed a sight that would haunt Christian Europe for generations. 120 Viking longships arranged in battle formation before their city walls, dragon heads gleaming in the morning sun. The fleet that should never have reached Paris dominated the Seine like a nightmare made manifest. Ragnar's psychological masterstroke was complete. The impossible had become undeniable reality. Ragnar understood something revolutionary about medieval psychology. The threat of violence could be more powerful than violence itself. His fleet made no immediate attack, creating a terror more devastating than any assault. Every hour the Vikings waited was an hour proving Frankish helplessness. Every moment they controlled the river was a moment demonstrating imperial inadequacy. The city's own walls had become a prison of fear. On the third day, Ragnar provided a demonstration that would break Christian resolve forever. 111 Frankish prisoners, soldiers, merchants, clergy caught outside Paris were hanged in full view of the city walls. Each execution was dedicated to the Viking war gods, each death a message to those watching. This was the price of resistance. The screams echoing across the Seine weren't just cries of dying men. They were the sound of imperial authority cracking. Emperor Charles the Bald, descendant of Charlemagne, found himself trapped in his own capital by pagans who had appeared from nowhere. His armies were scattered across the empire. His walls couldn't reach the river. His authority was evaporating with each passing hour. The man who ruled most of Western Europe was helpless against Vikings, who controlled nothing but their ships. Ragnar had achieved the impossible, making an emperor a prisoner in his own palace. Ragnar's ransom demand shattered every precedent in medieval diplomacy. 7,000 pounds of silver, more wealth than most kingdoms possessed, more treasure than any warrior had ever demanded. But this wasn't just about money, it was about humiliation. The silver had to be delivered publicly, acknowledging Viking superiority before both armies. Ragnar was demanding that an emperor bow to a pirate. Ragnar's negotiation tactics were as revolutionary as his military strategy. This wasn't traditional conquest, it was political theater designed to humiliate imperial authority while maximizing profit. Viking envoys met Frankish nobles not as barbarians begging for scraps, but as professionals conducting business with incompetent customers. The psychological reversal was complete. The civilized empire was buying mercy from savage raiders. 7,000 pounds of silver represented the economic output of entire regions. To raise such wealth, Charles the Bald stripped monastery treasuries, confiscated noble hoards, and emptied royal reserves built over generations. The ransom payment would cripple the empire's finances for years, proving that Ragnar's terror was more expensive than any war. Each silver coin was acknowledgement that Viking innovation had trumped imperial tradition. Ragnar's genius lay in the payment details. The silver had to be weighed publicly, carried by Frankish nobles, delivered with expressions of gratitude for Viking mercy. This wasn't just robbery, it was imperial submission performed as public theater. Every Frankish noble carrying silver to Viking ships was acknowledging that their emperor had been defeated by superior strategy. For the first time in medieval history, terror itself had become negotiable currency. Ragnar had proven that the right kind of fear could purchase anything, even imperial submission. This represented a complete revolution in medieval power dynamics. Strength measured not by conquest, but by psychological dominance. Viking innovation had created a new form of warfare, more profitable than traditional raiding. The payment took 3 days to complete. Carts laden with silver coins, ingots, and precious objects rolled from Paris to the Viking fleet in a procession of imperial humiliation. Each delivery was photographed into the memory of every witness, the mighty Frankish Empire buying peace from pagans who had appeared from nowhere. Ragnar had achieved something unprecedented, making submission profitable for both sides. With 7,000 pounds of silver secured, Ragnar faced his greatest challenge: escape. His fleet was 200 miles upriver, surrounded by increasingly hostile territory, carrying wealth that made them the most attractive target in Europe. Every strategic principle suggested they were trapped, but Ragnar had prepared for this moment months in advance. The master stroke was about to be revealed. As the fleet began its retreat, Ragnar's true genius became apparent. Hidden ships emerged from tributary streams, planted agents opened fortress gates, and carefully positioned allies attacked Frankish forces from behind. This wasn't an escape. It was a coordinated extraction operation, requiring months of preparation and intelligence networks spanning hundreds of miles. The Vikings hadn't just raided Paris, they had infiltrated an entire kingdom. Frankish forces massing at Rouen discovered too late that blocking the river was impossible against navigators who knew every current, every hidden channel, every tactical advantage the Seine offered. Ragnar's fleet moved like water itself, flowing around obstacles, dividing when necessary, reuniting when advantageous. Superior seamanship trumped superior numbers once again. By the time Ragnar's fleet reached open sea, not a single ship had been lost, not a single warrior killed in battle. They had executed the most profitable raid in medieval history and escaped without consequences. The impossible had been achieved through planning that bordered on supernatural. Terror had proved more valuable than conquest, psychology more powerful than armies. 7,000 pounds of silver transformed not just Ragnar's fortune, but Viking culture itself. This single raid generated more wealth than most kingdoms accumulated in decades, but the real treasure was strategic. Ragnar had proven that psychological warfare could achieve what traditional conquest could not. The Viking Age had evolved from raiding to ransom, from conquest to calculated terror. Within months of Paris, the psychological revolution Ragnar had created spread across Viking Scandinavia. Every ambitious raider understood the lesson. Terror could be more profitable than traditional conquest. Ransom raids replaced random violence. Calculated psychology replaced berserker fury. Medieval warfare itself was evolving in response to Ragnar's innovation. The ransom of Paris shattered something fundamental in Frankish imperial psychology. If the capital itself wasn't safe, if the emperor could be forced to pay tribute to pagans, what did that say about divine protection? Noble confidence evaporated, imperial authority cracked, and the myth of Frankish invincibility died in the Seine's waters. Ragnar had achieved through psychology what armies couldn't accomplish through conquest. Ragnar Lothbrok's name became synonymous with impossible victory across medieval Europe. His long blonde braided hair, piercing ice blue eyes, and massive warrior frame were described in chronicles from Ireland to Constantinople. But his true legend wasn't physical, it was intellectual. The Viking who had outthought an empire, who had turned fear into currency. Terror had a face, and that face was Ragnar's. The success of psychological warfare transformed Viking culture from simple raiders into sophisticated negotiators. Ships still carried warriors, but now they also carried diplomats who understood terror as a bargaining tool. Ragnar had revolutionized not just warfare, but Viking identity itself. They were no longer just pirates, they were psychological warfare specialists. The ransom of Paris established precedents that would dominate medieval politics for centuries. Tribute payments to Viking leaders became routine. Negotiation replaced automatic resistance, and psychological warfare became accepted diplomatic practice. Ragnar had literally rewritten the rules of international relations. One raid had changed how empires thought about power itself. Medieval chroniclers, even those who hated Vikings, acknowledged Ragnar's revolutionary genius. He had achieved something unprecedented, forcing an emperor to acknowledge barbarian superiority through peaceful negotiation. This wasn't conquest. It was something entirely new in medieval politics. In his great hall, Ragnar celebrated surrounded by Frankish silver and warriors who had witnessed the impossible. They feasted as men who had revolutionized warfare itself, turning psychology into the ultimate weapon. The silver that should have defended Paris now funded Viking ambitions. They drank to the ransom master who had made emperors pay for the privilege of survival. Ragnar's Ransom of Paris became the template for asymmetric warfare across history. From medieval sieges to modern terrorism, the principle remained constant. Psychological pressure could achieve what physical force could not. The Vikings who sailed home in 845 AD carried more than silver. They carried the knowledge that terror was the ultimate weapon. Fear could be manufactured, packaged, and sold to emperors desperate enough to buy peace. From the smoking docks of Paris emerged a truth that echoes through modern warfare. Sometimes the greatest victories are won without firing a shot. Sometimes the most devastating weapons are psychological rather than physical. The ransom master had proven that with the right strategy, the impossible becomes not just possible, but profitable.